Welcome to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Our mission is to bring you discussions on a wide array of topics in the coaching world to grow players on and off the court. You can connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and also reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Now, here's your host, Coach Mike Hernandez.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us here for another episode, wherever in the world you are listening to us from, whatever platform you're listening to us on. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for the continued support. As all of you know, in the introduction of this show, one of my goals in this podcast is to bring you discussions on a wide array of topics and a wide array of basketball related things. So I want to cover basketball in coaching and the way the game's played and the way it's coached, every single sort of facet and form of basketball I wanted to cover here. And that's why I'm so excited to have my guest on today, because we are going to be talking specifically about wheelchair basketball on this episode today. We're going to talk about kind of what wheelchair basketball looks like, how it's played, how it's coached, and just kind of the state of wheelchair basketball in general in my guest area. So whether you know a lot about it or a little about it, you are going to learn something new today, because I know very little about this. So I know I'm going to be learning a lot about this as well. And I'm really excited to be able to bring this to you guys today. So I'm very excited to be joined today by a member of two different organizations, Coventry Crusaders Wheelchair Basketball Academy Club, and then Worcester Wolves Wheelchair Basketball Team. My guest today is Sarah Hope. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm great. Thanks. How are you?
I'm great too. We make it work with this time difference and everything, and I'm excited to have you on, because like I said, I don't know a whole lot about this specific facet of basketball, so I'm really excited to do some learning here as well. So to get started, can you kind of walk us through your basketball journey and where kind of basketball started to fit in within your life journey, and then ultimately what's led you to Coventry and Worcester, where you play at right now?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose to get the first things out of the way, I grew up able-bodied, so I didn't have a disability when I was younger. I played a little bit of basketball, like literally for one semester. It wasn't an option for girls at my high school. We had netball, which is slightly different. It's a sport we have in the UK. I don't know if you have that there.
I don't know if I'm familiar with that, but
it's less exciting. You don't get to dribble the ball.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't want that. But when you get to high school, games like that, it's a bit of a popularity contest. So sort of I took a step back from that. By the time I acquired my disability, I was 24. I was into running at that point. And I only really got back into basketball because the only other disabled person I knew at the time played basketball, and he invited me along to train with his club. I actually just went along to watch. I was too shy to join in, but they had odd numbers and they were like, oh, join in with the scrimmage. And before you know it, there I am playing wheelchair basketball for the first time. So yeah, 24. I got into basketball quite late, which can happen in adaptive sports, because if you don't have your disability when you're younger, you get into adaptive sports later.
Sure.
And yeah, first moment I tried it, I loved it. Started playing with Coventry, which is an amateur club here in the UK. And 3 years later, I was invited to my first camp for Great Britain.
It's really interesting, kind of like that you brought up about, if like adaptive sports, like you said, like you can think, your kind of journey goes one place, and then you end up, as you mentioned, you have in the wheelchair, and then it's like, well, you still have this opportunity to still like continue playing, or still like do it in a maybe a different way than you had expected, but get into it late. And I think that's kind of a cool story that I'll just go watch, and then before you know it, it's like, no, I'm playing again. Like you're right back in it, right?
Yeah, it wasn't really a thought for me that I wouldn't be doing sports. Sure. After I found my disability. I just, yeah, I was running, I was doing like some archery and some other things. And then when I acquired my disability, it wasn't ever really a thought of, oh, I shouldn't do sport. It was a case of, okay, what sport do I do now? Which I think it was a big help for me at the time. Big help.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, you're a part of a couple different clubs and teams, and just to kind of set the stage, I suppose, for the listeners, I wanted to talk about what the organization level is for wheelchair basketball in your area. I did a little bit of research, and I think I have like a little bit of understanding. I get the sense that there's kind of like a Premier League of some sorts and an NBL. I was wondering if you can kind of walk us through kind of like the different leagues or different tiers that exist for wheelchair basketball out there in your area.
Yeah, sure. So in the UK, we have like a national league, and that's co-ed or men's, but it's co-ed. That's completely amateur. So we have 4 divisions. We've got D3, D2, D1, and then a Premier League. In women's only sport, we have D2, D1, and then Women's Premier League, which is the professional league. But as we mentioned, I call it a professional league. It's a professionalized league. You look at it, it's, I suppose, like you might see college sports in the US. It's a big event, and they sell tickets and merchandise, and you get all of the stuff you'd expect, but we don't actually get paid.
I can imagine that must be difficult from a commitment perspective, to know that you're going to be putting in that much time, and you're going to have to dedicate so much of yourself to probably play at the level that like you want to be playing at, but then also know like I'm also not getting paid too, so you have to kind of take into account like your own livelihood, right, versus like how much you can commit to playing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the hope is that one day the Women's Premier League will go fully professional. I think for people that are looking to start their career, maybe in international basketball, it's a great place to get your training in, to get noticed. And I think when you're starting out and you've got big aspirations like that, you're willing to put the time in. Like, I certainly did years of getting up at 5:30 in the morning to train before work. And there's the guys that are still studying the college and university, and they'll get up and fit it around their classes, and the rest of us have to just try and fit it around work when we can. And you do it for the love of the game, don't you?
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, you have to love the game a lot if you're going to put in that much time, and then also try to fit in all of your professional or teaching responsibilities. Yeah, no, that's busy days, busy weeks, busy months, probably busy years too. being put into that. So you kind of have the perspective of having played basketball in both senses, with and without a wheelchair, and so I want to kind of help sort of paint the picture about in what ways is wheelchair basketball similar in the way that we traditionally think of basketball? What are kind of the similarities? And we'll start with that. So when we think of wheelchair basketball, I think that maybe there might be some misconceptions, or people might think it's like a completely different game or completely different sport entirely. But in your experience, in what ways do you think that it's very similar to the way that we may traditionally think of basketball being played?
I think it's probably more similar than most people think. Like when you first start talking about wheelchair basketball, people think, oh, it must be a different court, must be different size hoops. Like, we play on the same court, we play the same size hoops, the same lines. It's, we play under the same sort of FIBA rules that most people are familiar with. There really isn't a whole lot of difference. I think we don't have double dribble rules. That's probably the biggest thing that I can think of. So we could theoretically hold the ball, push the chair, and then carry on dribbling if we need to. That's effectively a step. Pushing the wheel is like taking a step.
Okay.
And so in stand-up basketball, you would then have to pass or shoot. We get to carry on dribbling. I think that's probably the biggest difference, until you look at a slightly more sort of technical look. Obviously, we can't move sideways because of the wheels.
Yeah.
So in terms of how it looks, it might be a little bit more technical in terms of how we move, a little maybe less fluid than you would expect in the stand-up game, but in reality that there really aren't that many differences.
And so when you found yourself starting to really get involved with it for the first time and really starting to play the first time, did you kind of find that this is like, oh, this is actually, there's a lot of similarities, or the adjustment period wasn't maybe as steep as you thought? Did you kind of find that you sort of transitioned into it kind of seamlessly, or were there any like sort of bumps in the road?
I suppose with the first time I got into a basketball chair, I wasn't using a wheelchair in day-to-day life. I was still using crutches. So for me, the big adaptation was learning how to move the chair and still dribble the basketball without just crashing into people. That sort of multitasking, having good ball control whilst also having good chair control, that was the hardest part. And I think once you become a little bit more accustomed to the chair, it is a fairly simple transition, I'd say.
Yeah, that's and I think that's also perhaps maybe a unique situation that you yourself had by not having been in a wheelchair your whole life, that there was like that adaptive period of the actual chair itself, and then also kind of like playing the sport as well. So you're kind of like juggling like a couple new things happening at once, so to speak.
Yeah, to an extent. I think there are a number of players, even at the highest level, that don't use a wheelchair in day-to-day life. Some guys use crutches, some guys can walk, maybe some amputees might use a prosthetic. So not everyone uses a day chair in day-to-day life, but I think the way that you use a day chair compared to how you use a basketball chair is actually quite different. So yes, there might be a bit of an advantage for people that are a day chair user at the beginning when you're first learning.
Yeah,
I think once you're accustomed to using the basketball chair, there isn't a great advantage being a day chair user there.
And I might as well ask about that difference, about when you're using chair for basketball, how is that designed differently than one that might be used like for day-to-day use?
So I think the most obvious is that there's a camber on the wheels. So the wheels will stick out at an angle, usually about 18 to 20 degrees. That means you can turn a lot quicker. If your wheels are upright and you turn quickly, you'll tip yourself out. So having an angle on the wheels will just keep you stable. And there's also a large metal offensive wing that goes around the foot plate at the front, because as much as basketball is a non-contact sport, I think we all know that a bit of contact happens.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that just allows you to sort of slide off other people's chairs. And then there's going to be a height difference, and that's very much dependent on your impairment. So I don't want to get too detailed here, but you take someone like me, for example. My disability only affects me below the knee, so I've got full core strength. I can hold myself upright in my chair. I can sit pretty high, the maximum allowed in the league, whereas some guys, maybe their impairment, maybe spinal cord injury from the chest, for example, they won't have core strength. They may have to sit a little bit lower, almost in a bucketed chair, maybe with their knees a bit higher, just to maintain some stability. So their basketball chair might be lower than their day chair, whereas mine's higher. So
I guess I never really considered that, but that makes a lot of sense, that people's conditions that they might be in for a wheelchair might be completely different in terms of what their mobility might be like, or what they can or can't do in terms of their physical mobility. I guess it's such an obvious thing, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because I wouldn't have ever really thought about it that way. But yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I imagine too that these chairs, because basketball, we know basketball is a contact sport. These chairs must be able to handle a bit of a beating too, and be able to handle a bit of wear and tear on them, because I imagine that they're getting some collisions more than once throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to wonder sometimes why we bother painting them, because that paint's going to come off pretty quick. one of my teammates said to me this week, she's like, the front of your chair is all flattened. Is it supposed to be like that? I'm like, yeah, well, when you've hit a few people, it'll do that.
Yeah.
They should last a few years, but if you're playing all day, every day, you might need to change frames.
Yeah.
Quite regularly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like there's something wrong if your chair doesn't have some battle wounds or battle scars on it, right?
For sure.
Funny. So let's talk about a little bit about the uniqueness then that goes into the way that you and your teammates prepare. Obviously, you talked a little bit about the dribbling, and so the ball handling aspect is probably a little bit differently from stand-up ball, but what are some other things that you would consider to be like pretty unique in terms of whether it's the way that you personally train and prepare, or even the way that like kind of like your teammates and you kind of uniquely train and prepare?
I suppose, yeah, like we've covered, like the major difference is going to be about people's disability, about their impairment. That's inescapable fact in wheelchair basketball. In this country, we do have able-bodied people playing as well, so it is a fully inclusive sport. If people want to play, they can play. They just can't play internationally. So I say everyone's disabled. Not everyone is disabled, but most people are going to have some kind of disability. And it's pretty much your impairment in your basketball chair that determines the position you're going to play. So it's not really a case of your height or your playing style that might dictate how you play in the stand-up game. It's more your impairment. So because I'm what we call a high point player, very briefly, you're given a number out of 5 as to how impaired you are. So an able-bodied player in the UK will be a 5-pointer. And you can have 14 or 14 and a half points on the floor at any one time. So your 5 players can't add up to more than 14 and a half.
Okay. Yeah.
So you can't get away with playing 5 massive guys that are just missing one toe. That's cheating. You have to have a full range of impairments, and that's what makes the sport fully inclusive. So I'm a 4.5, which means I've got like a minimal disability. Like I said, it's below the knees. I sit quite tall. I'm 6 foot as it is, so I'm pretty big for a girl. So I'm a center. That's kind of how it's determined. Guys with a more severe disability who maybe sit lower might end up playing point guard, shooting guard. They'll stay outside, they'll get the long shots, whereas I'm in the key, I'm in the paint. That's kind of where I'm at. So your training is pretty much determined by your impairment, which then obviously determines your position on court. Yeah. If I haven't just overcomplicated things.
No, I think that's so like it's really interesting to think about, like you mentioned, kind of like the numbers and the way that how it's based off of the level of disability that you have. And I think that sort of is a little bit eye-opening, because I think there's probably like a misconception, and I brought this up earlier about how like you kind of see players who are in wheelchairs, and you see them play and you just sort of have an assumption like they're all like at the exact same like level, or their their disability is all the exact same. But no, that of course that doesn't make sense. Of course that's not the case, or not the way that the situation works at all. And so for your own, since you say that you're center, you play more down in the post, what sort of goes into your own kind of individual preparation? I guess my question is about how do you work on your skills? What does that sort of look like for you in terms of like practicing, getting better? What are some of the sort of things that you focus on in your training?
I suppose again, it's going to be quite similar to what you'd expect from a stand-up team. When I was with GB, I was on court 6-7 times a week, games at weekends. Now that I'm retired from international basketball, it's more 4 times a week. I'm doing my own cardio to be able to get down the floor and get into position. I'm in the gym 2-3 times a week, 3 times in preseason. I try not to do that the rest of the time. But yeah, when I'm on court, I'm concentrating on what I want to do, crashing into the key, keeping the ball high, putting it in the hoop. I think my training is going to it is going to be different to some of my teammates because of the position they play, because of their impairment. There are going to be things that I can do on court and I'm expected to do on court that they can't. And similarly, they can do things on court that I shouldn't really be doing. That's not how I am used most effectively, in the same way that you'd expect in the running game. Yeah.
So I suppose then, in terms of, even if it's like technique on certain things, whether it's I'll just take like shooting, for example, the form itself, is it just the same as it would be for a kind of like a stand-up game, if you're working on like your form, or you're working on getting shots up or things like that? Does the same sort of kind of technique go into that as one might expect in like a stand-up game?
Yeah, I think so. It's the big difference, or for me anyway, the big difference is obviously you don't have the jump. I don't have to worry about my vertical. That's not an issue for me. So when I shoot, it is, yeah, I'll use my body a little bit, but it's going to be shoulders, triceps, follow through. That's it. Somebody once told me that shooting a free throw in the wheelchair game is like trying to shoot a 3-pointer in the stand-up game, because you don't get to go through your legs, you don't get to use your knees. So you do have to put a lot more power into it. For some guys that might have an impairment around their arms, that's going to be a completely different technique for them. But for me, my technique is very much like it is for stand-up. So yeah, I'll be sitting there at the edge of the key, just shot after shot after shot in the same way, just working on touch the same way that you'd expect.
Well, yeah, and when I'm coaching, of my girls, it's so much about, like, make sure you get your legs under you, make sure you have like a good like base and everything, and how much of it comes from your legs. So, and I guess going back into like your training in the gym, I imagine that like you're really making sure that your arms and your shoulders, kind of that upper body, like you're really working on making sure that's strong, and that's really like you're physically capable to doing that, because like you mentioned, you don't have the legs to kind of get under you on a shot. So I imagine that like getting that work in the gym and making sure arms and shoulders and everything are getting worked on is probably really vital in order to have like good form and getting good shots up.
Yeah, for sure. Shoulder, elbow and wrist injuries are a lot more, those are the standard in wheelchair basketball. We don't get ACL problems or anything like that in our game. So we do spend a lot of time just rehab around those joints, because biologically speaking, they're not really designed to take the amount of abuse that we put them through on a day-to-day basis. So you really have to take care of those joints. And yeah, we get to spend a lot of time in the gym on upper body. For me, I can work all the way down to my knees. Some guys are just gonna work literally back, chest and arms, because that's what they've got access to. And yeah, you talk about getting your legs under you. And for us, it's more like which way is your chair pointing? So if you're closed off, you're shooting across your body, it's never going to work. You want to open yourself up, you want to be facing the right way. For me, I've got core strength. I can twist my chair without necessarily touching the wheels. Some guys have to bounce the ball, adjust the chair, make sure they're facing the right way. So I think there are a lot of the same sort of fundamentals to shooting practice there.
Well, we talk about with the girls I coach about make sure like where your feet pointed at, right? I mean, make sure right there too. The old, I think, traditional way was like 10 toes to the basket sort of thing. So that makes a lot of sense about the way to making sure your chair is aligned. So about the physicality, because you are you're in the trenches, you're in that post position more. So I'm gonna have to ask about what goes into technique in terms of things like getting rebounding, or I'll just focus on rebounding in general. Like what kind of goes into being an effective rebounder for you? What sort of is like the technique? What sort of similarities or differences do you think may exist from what we would consider like rebounding technique or post technique like that?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to watch yesterday's game back because I saw the stats and apparently I got 15 rebounds, but I don't remember how. Um, I suppose because the fundamental difference is we don't jump. So the height in your chair, if you've got a long body and you sit tall, you've got an immediate advantage. If you can tilt your chair up onto two wheels, onto the side to give yourself a little bit of extra height, you've got an advantage. But again, fundamentals are going to win out over anything flashy every day. So for us, defensive rebounds, it's about boxing out. If you can prevent the offensive team from getting into that key, they put up an outside shot, that's fine. It's easier to prevent them crashing into the key to get offensive boards when you're in a chair because you're a fixed width. No one can slip past you, really.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, if you back onto them, if you've got the rubber of your wheel against the front of their chair, they're going to have to back up before they can go around you. So if you can get into the right position, hold them there and then go in to get that rebound, that they say that you should be able to let the ball bounce in the key because everyone should be defensively boxing out. And then you can go and pick it up. Yeah,
I guess that's really, I guess, again, these things that when you explain them to me are like, oh, that seems really makes sense. But like, even just the fact of like knowing about like the length of the chair itself and like these like certain, that's like a variable that, it doesn't maybe necessarily have to come into play because you kind of are aware of like what the I'm assuming it's standard kind of the measurements of the way that the chairs are, and it's something that you can already account for and not really have to have like be one of the variables maybe you necessarily have to like take into consideration when it comes to things even like boxing out.
Yeah, it's some people are going to have narrower chairs than others. I'm quite a big girl. I'm going to have a fairly wide chair, but I know that if I sit 2 feet away from the baseline, no one's going to slip past me there. No one's thin enough to fit in that gap. So I can literally ignore them and look up court. It's having good chair position. It does make the game a lot more, I suppose, tactical than the stand-up game, because it is about where you put your chair. And if you're just 1 centimeter, oh, sorry, I've slipped back into metric. If you're just 1 inch in front of the other person's chair, they're not going to get through you. It's made of metal. It's not going to budge. You can't just throw a shoulder at someone and squeeze past. That doesn't happen in the wheelchair game because the wheelchair's wider than your shoulders. It's it's fixed. It's a fixed width.
Yeah, and again, one of those things like, of course it is, but then it's like, oh, now that you explained it, I'm like, I just didn't even think about it or consider it. But no, that obviously makes a lot of logistical and just logical sense in general that you brought that up. So now that I've kind of, I feel like I'm like piecing together like a basketball scenario here. So now once you get a rebound, or all 15 rebounds that you got there, does the game kind of look traditional in the sense of like a stand-up game where you get your defensive rebound, you look for an outlet person, you get out like on a fast break just like we would in like a stand-up game? Or those sort of situational things kind of very similar?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm likely to get a rebound just because of my size, and the first thing I'm looking for is to give it to a ball handler because I don't want the ball. I don't want to bring the ball up the court. I want to get rid of it, and I just want to sprint because that's what I do. Assuming they're not pressing up, which again, like we just talked about, boxing out. I think it's easier to do a man-on-man press in the wheelchair game because you're using quite a big shield. Your chair is, you can use it quite effectively to prevent someone to getting down court. But if they're just playing a normal zone defense, then it is a case of getting the ball out. I think one of the fundamentals in the wheelchair game is that because we can't sidestep, we're effectively looking for people to go out to the sidelines and then cut back in for a passing angle. If we think someone's going straight down court, they're going to have to look behind them to receive the ball. It doesn't really work when you can't just stop and turn the same way that you can when you're standing up. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, it does.
So there's a little bit more in terms of, angles, passing angles, because we don't have that ease of turning the same way you do when you're standing up. But otherwise, effectively, if we can get down there within a few seconds, and fast break is ideal, saves me a job. But if not, setting up your standard offense and using the clock, it's pretty much the same.
And I think that one of the things that is just particularly fascinating is just how much in terms of just the way the game is played, because I have seen a little bit on and off, and it was funny. I remember I was watching, it may have even been more at the Olympic level, and seeing like a team like run a set, and I'm like, wait, I know exactly kind of what they're running and what they're doing. It maybe looks a little bit differently, but I could see the way that like the things were being set up, and like, oh, I think they're running this, and I think this zone defense is what they're doing, and it's like, oh no, this is basketball. I know what this is. Like, this looks very similar to what I'm used to.
For
and
sure.
That's funny. And kind of transition to that, as I was doing my initial research, I did not get the sense, and I could be completely wrong, but for my initial research, it didn't seem that all of the coaches necessarily are either wheelchair bound or even use wheelchairs. So let me ask that first. Was I right in that research? Was my research wrong, or can you explain? Can you clarify? Explain that to me first.
Yeah, for sure. So like I said earlier, we have able-bodied players. We have players that can walk even though they are disabled. They can't play the running game, but they can still walk. And then we have sort of day chair users as well. So the same way that we have a diverse range of players, we have diverse range of coaches and staff and everything else. So we'll have some coaches that are wheelchair users, some that aren't. I think you might find in the running game as well as in the wheelchair game that you find a lot of ex-players maybe going into coaching afterwards. Sure. So in that respect, you may end up having wheelchair users that played the game and have now moved into coaching, and others that are just a fan of the sport or a fan of basketball and have found their way into the wheelchair game.
And is there any challenge that you think exists for coaches who may not be in the same like situation, or their disability may be at like different levels than others? Is there any sort of challenge for coaches to maybe coach players who are in different situations or have different range of mobility, or is it just it's not really taken into consideration, and it's not something that affects things too much?
I've had an able-bodied coach in the past who, moved over from the running game. And I think it was possibly his first real foray into the world of disability. So he's still like, trying to make sure he's not saying the wrong words and making sure he's being like super politically correct about not offending people, but perhaps still doesn't quite get the difference, when someone's given a points classification. Just because you have 2 3-point players, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the same impairment or the same disability. It just means that they're seen as having a similar functional ability when they're sitting in their basketball chair. And I think the same way that for anyone who's not been around disabled people, has that learning curve, that massive learning curve of figuring out what people can and can't do, that, the things that you perhaps should or shouldn't say, and the things you have to take into consideration, when you start coaching a team. I think in terms of, a chair user versus a non-chair user, like I said, the basketball chair is such a different piece of equipment to a day chair.
Right.
if you just think of the basketball chair like a piece of sporting equipment, think of it like a bicycle or a kayak or hockey skates, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you think of it just as a piece of sporting equipment, like, yeah, you kind of want your coach to be familiar with that piece of sporting equipment,
Sure.
but they don't necessarily have to use it themselves to be able to coach you how to use it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, no, it does, and that was why I was curious about it, because I wondered if there was a situation for maybe like, a coach who doesn't use one, or you mentioned how you had a coach who didn't use one, like you just didn't quite, if there was that like disconnect of like not really understanding, what this was like, or, what the situation that I was in, or, what I can or can't do, and whether or not, things get sort of lost in the discussion because there's just maybe certain language or just certain situations, that a coach like that who's not who doesn't use a wheelchair just like wouldn't necessarily understand, even about like day-to-day life, even about using a wheelchair, and whether or not that caused any complications. But it sounds like, that coach would just, like any other coach, that coach would just have to, really put the work in, and if they're going to want to be successful at it, they're going to have to put the time, put the commitment, and be willing to learn and understand that the situation that their players are in by being wheelchair bound, and really commit to that in order to be effective as a coach, it seems.
Yeah, I think, and you have to remember, I'm guessing it's got to be a weird situation to be in if you're an able-bodied coach and you're coming into an environment full of disabled people. Like you're the minority. Like we're all used to disability.
You're the outsider, sort of.
Yeah. So, we're all quite open and honest about our disabilities. We have a lot of banter. We make jokes about each other. It's fair game. And, as them coming in, like suddenly, I think in society, disability is still viewed as a bit of a taboo subject. Like, am I allowed to talk about it? If I'm able-bodied, am I allowed to like mention it? Am I allowed to point it out? Whatever. And then there's us as a group of athletes, just like, stealing each other's fake legs or whatever. Just, it's perfectly natural for us, and it's a case of, yeah, they'll learn pretty quick what day-to-day life is like for us. I think when it comes to the on-court stuff, there may be a slight disadvantage for coaches that haven't played the game, just in terms of the nuances of how to handle the basketball chair.
Yeah.
Because you do handle that so differently to a day chair. Even if you're a day chair user and you've never played basketball, you're going to be at a slight disadvantage there. But
like I'm just trying to put myself in that situation, and I know, like, if I was to, I'm just going back to a previous example, try to like correct somebody like on their form, I would feel so like disingenuous, because I don't know, like I've never had to shoot a basketball in that way, so I'd feel so like hypocritical, like, oh, you're doing this wrong, but also like I can't do it because I don't know, I don't shoot it, I don't shoot a basketball that way. So like it would be, I know for me personally, it would be something where I would probably really struggle to try and correct, or try to train or teach, if I had never been in that situation before. I don't feel like I would even feel like authentic, or feel like I'm an authority figure on any of this, because I myself like hadn't like experienced it or been through it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there are there's two elements to it. There's the day-to-day living, like, is someone disability aware? And then there's the piece of sporting equipment, it's the basketball chair. And as long as a coach is competent in the equipment used in our sport, it, like, the rest of it will come with time, like the knowledge about living with a disability. In the same way that you wouldn't correct someone's form if you've never picked up a basketball. Yeah. You'd have to learn. You'd have to learn about the chair in order to coach someone in wheelchair basketball. That's just the equipment that we use in our sport. And I think once people get get the idea in their head that this is a sport in its own right, not a disabled version of basketball. This is just wheelchair basketball. We just have an additional piece of equipment, and the players have to learn it, and the coach has to learn it, and everyone else has to just learn this extra piece of equipment. It's less of a scary subject, I think.
Yeah. No, well, it's like you said, it's the piece of the equipment that you said is used like within, basketball itself. And like you said, like understanding the way that like here's how this equipment is used, and be like proficient and understand the way that it's used. And then, as you mentioned, like I feel like once you get past that, or once you understand that, or once you learn about that, then it's like, well, it's basketball, and like you're there to compete. Your teammates are there to compete, and it's like, well, here we go. Like let's like you said, like, well, let's do the basketball, and let's get the coaching, and let's get all that going. And then, as you mentioned, right, that coach over time will just learn about the day-to-day situation that their players are in, and will become like familiar with it that way. But like you said, right, that'll come with time, and just putting in the time to work with the players and get to know them.
Sure. Yeah.
So what has and this is very, very broad and very general, but I know that you mentioned that even once you got your disability, that you were always going to be, you're always going to be active, and you're always going to find, sports and things to get involved in. So what has been the importance of basketball in your life, and not just by playing it because you have a disability, but also the fact that you were able to kind of jump into it when you started at 24. So how is kind of basketball in general, what has been the importance of it in your life?
Absolutely crucial. Like, I don't think I can understate the importance of wheelchair basketball in me accepting my disability. So yeah, I spent 24 years as an able-bodied person, and then suddenly I have a disability, and you don't expect to become disabled at 24. That's you don't really expect to become disabled at any age, but at 24 it's not really something that you consider. And then I'm sort of transitioning to this very unknown world. I don't really know anything about disability and mobility aids and how you're supposed to go about doing anything. And especially if able-bodied sports is a big part of your identity, you end up reassessing who you are as a person. It can be a bit bewildering, not just the practical elements, but who you are as a person. And then I go along and I try wheelchair basketball, and I joined a club pretty quickly, and I'm surrounded by all of these people with varying disabilities who are just getting on with their lives and going to work and having relationships and playing competitive sports. And you're just in this familiar environment. Basketball court's a basketball court. You get back in it and you're like, oh yeah, it's a basketball court. Like, nothing's changed. I'm still going to have a job. I'm still going to have a relationship, and I can still play sports. And for me, having that there was just so useful in the transition into accepting who I was, and this new identity, which really was the same as my old identity, except now I sit down.
Like and what I get kind of like the sense of kind of from your answer is like, one of the things I feel like basketball maybe kind of did for you, it was kind of like this something that was like very familiar, and as you found yourself kind of in a very unfamiliar situation, to be able to like go and play like basketball and get involved with it, it was like kind of like something, oh, like this is something like I'm comfortable, like I know what this is, like this is like a situation that like, I know basketball, this is something like I love doing, and I've always loved doing, and I can keep doing it. So it seems like it was something like very familiar to you, and probably like kind of comforting in a sense to be able to get right into it and play it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, I was so used to sort of being competitive and sort of pushing myself hard in sport, which, I'm walking around on crutches, like not particularly well. I'm going everywhere super slowly. Everything's really frustrating. And then I sit in a basketball chair for the first time, I can literally push as fast as my arms can carry me. And I'm like, oh, there's the competitive edge again. Like, I'm not this sort of, decrepit, broken body. This is a case of I can do everything that I want to do, just in a slightly different way. It really is about adapting and getting on with things.
Yeah. And that kind of transitions there to a follow-up question I was going to ask, because I know that we have those listening who know individuals who are in a wheelchair or just otherwise have, physical limitations of some sort. And so what would you say is the importance of remaining active and remaining like physically active, especially for those maybe who have that wheelchair bound or have a physical disability at a young age or at a younger age? What would you say is the importance for those individuals to remain, physically active?
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously we all know the advantages of being, a physical education, of being active and being healthy, and all of the bonuses that brings. But I think when you see people with disabilities that perhaps don't have the same access to sports that able-bodied people do, you hear a lot of people at schools that their sort of, their PE department isn't geared up to accommodate them, so they end up having to sit out of sports lessons of any type of competitive sport. I think being able to go and join a sport with people that are similar to you, and just remain active, it allows kids to be included, and I think that's, that does a lot more for their confidence, because if you're young and you're disabled, you're constantly being told you can't do this, you can't do that. These are the things that you're excluded from. Mm-hmm. To be included in something is going to be hugely beneficial. And of course, if you're excluded from an awful lot of physical activities, just having that physical literacy, that competency, that's going to increase your independence in day-to-day life. It's going to just that's going to increase your confidence, your ability to do things for yourself. I can't promote that enough.
Yeah, and it's, and I imagine, and it's really a challenge, I can imagine, especially for those at a younger age, because as you mentioned, to put it bluntly, like the world isn't designed or hasn't been adapted necessarily for people who have or who are wheelchair bound. And so, as you mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities, right, that have been excluded or they're just not a part of. And I imagine then it'd be very easy, for a child or somebody who's younger to just sort of like feel like they just want to give up, or feel like, well, there's nothing, there's nothing like mm-hmm. there for me, because like you said, always being told like what you can't do or what you can't be a part of. And so I can just imagine, like, for somebody like that to get involved in like a sport or get involved with something that keeps them physically active. But then also I think, and I'll let you speak to that, I think just to be involved in something that's like competitive and like something that they're really like competing and they're working hard and they're doing the same things that anyone else who's going to be playing a stand-up sport. But I feel that those opportunities maybe for like physical competition could mm-hmm. be so limited or be so excluded from. But I feel like it's, especially for those at a young age, like it's so important, if they're like want to be physical and want to be active, just to be able to compete, I could imagine would just be like really just wonderful and just great for them in terms of just not just their physical, but I imagine, right, their emotional and just mental development, to just be able to still mm-hmm. like be competing and playing sports at a high level, regardless of what their condition would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being competitive and knowing that you've got to go out and work hard is just integral to socialization anyway. Mm-hmm. I've known a few people with disabilities that have had disabilities since they were young, since they were born, and perhaps have overprotective parents, we say, and provide a lot for them and wrap them in cotton wool, and things are handed to them. So the fact that they then have, in a sporting environment, have to work, and they might not win. It's not going to be handed to you. You're going to have to learn these things, like, as much as your parents are going to going to protect you as much as they can, you also have to work for it, and you have to be competitive, and you have to understand what it's like to lose, because that is the world that we live in. I think a lot of times with disability sports, it's a case of, it's all about participation. Everyone gets a participation medal. It's like, no, these kids want to be competitive. They want to win.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's a lot of life lessons in that, I think.
Yeah, and I just remembered a story of, well, it's a personal experience of working with well, it wasn't even working, I was teaching a student who was wheelchair bound. And I remember, just having a conversation with her, and I know she did some sports, and I didn't necessarily coach her, but one of the things I remember she talked about that was, particularly frustrating sometimes, is she was like, "Miss, they're like, people just think like I'm fragile, or I'm gonna like break, or just like fall apart if you get too close to me." And I imagine that it can be like very frustrating. I'm sure there is a stigma that, people who are, wheelchair bound are, gonna fall apart if you like get too close to them, or like you can't like they're, you got to be like really, really careful around them. And I remember she was talking about, she's like, no, like, like I'm just, this is just the condition I'm in, but I do all these sports and I do all these things. Like, you don't have to like treat me differently, or, think that you have to be like so cautious around me, sort of thing. Like, just a person who's just playing sports.
Yeah.
So
I think, and you got to, some schools or some activity centers, they've got these health and safety rules, and as soon as they see a disabled person or someone in a wheelchair, they're just like, no, I don't think we should be allowing them to do anything, just in case. And you're just like, no, I think they can.
And I'll let you speak to this too, and is that, those who are, wheelchair bound too, like how do I word this correctly, like they know how to work within their wheelchair. They know what they can and can't do. Like, you don't need to, like, I don't need to speak for somebody about what they're able to or not able to. Like, you can advocate and speak for yourself, and you understand like where it is that you're at. And I imagine sometimes people who are maybe more who are able-bodied can kind of make assumptions about like what you can or can't do, and I imagine that can definitely feel pretty insulting, right, and pretty disrespectful to be told, what you can or can't do physically, or what you are capable of, right?
Oh yeah, and it happens like day to day, all the time. Sports, whatever. I had a medical appointment a little while ago, and I turned up to the place, registered at the reception desk, and someone came out. And they went to grab the handles on the back of my chair to push me. I don't have handles on the back of my chair because I am the person that pushes me. She just made the assumption that I'm in a wheelchair, therefore I can't move myself. And I'm just like, you're a nurse. You should know not to make these assumptions about people. And you get it all the time. It's okay, or people, speaking to you as if you can't hear them. Hello, are you okay? I'm not deaf. I'm sitting down.
Yeah.
It's just the stigma that you get, and you get the same in sports sometimes, especially around able-bodied people or in able-bodied environments. And I think that's bringing it back to the original question, and that is the advantage of being in a an adaptive or an accessible program, is that you're surrounded by people that are similar to you, that know, you can decide how fast you go, you can tip yourself out on the floor, like, if you like, crash into that wall. you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And if you can't, you'll soon learn that you can't.
Yeah. No, that's great. Last question before we hit our concluding segment. This is a big one here, asking you to think big landscape here, about the landscape of wheelchair basketball, and where you see the sport in general. So kind of two parts to this. In your time playing, what successes have you seen, or where do you see positively that the sport has been, and then also what are some areas of growth, or you think might be some future goals of growth for the sport itself?
Yeah, so I started playing in 2010, and then 2 years later we had the London Olympics and Paralympics in 2012, and we saw a massive increase in participation after that, and I think that just goes to show that people want to play the game, that people want to watch the game, and they want to get involved. but they just needed that media coverage to bring it to their attention in the first place. It just needed to be there on their TVs. It just needed to be there in the news. And especially when it comes to spectators, like I said earlier, like disability is still kind of seen as a bit of a taboo subject. So I think when you have an able-bodied sports fan looking for a sport to go and watch, they don't necessarily think that they should be watching wheelchair basketball. It's like, should I be watching disabled people? Am I allowed to do that? But I think once they've seen it, and they've seen it's just, like I said, it's a different sport. It's not a disabled version of basketball. You can still admire these athletes for what they're putting on the floor, and it's still a fun and exciting game to watch. So I think, you know, in reality, if we just had a little bit more media, a little bit more visibility,
sure,
you know, we would be a much bigger sport. And I think, you know, like I mentioned in a previous question, it was so integral for me for sort of adjusting to my disability. And there's going to be other adults out there that acquire disabilities as well as kids that don't quite know where to go when they've lost their able-bodied sport. And I think if we have that visibility like we did after London 2012, it would help a lot of people. And, you know, I'm playing for Worcester Wolves in the Women's Premier League. We've just had our inaugural season, well, just about to finish. So it's the first year of that. And I think that's going in the right direction. We've had, I don't know, something like 9 games televised on the TV. All the others obviously live streamed on YouTube or wherever else. But just the fact that it's out there for people to see, it's not just something that happens every 4 years at the Paralympics. This happens like every weekend. You know, this is a thing that is, you know, going on, and, you know, we've aligned ourselves with existing franchises. You know, Worcester Wolves has a men's stand-up team, a women's stand-up team, and now women's wheelchair team. And so by joining an existing franchise, we've inherited a fan base. So you've got all of these able-bodied basketball fans that are now seeing wheelchair basketball and can go away and say to, you know, their friends and family, maybe people that have a physical impairment, oh, do you know there's wheelchair basketball in Worcester? Why don't you go and see it? Why don't you go and join in? Why don't you see if you can find a club? So in terms of, you know, growth for the future, London 2012 was a great place to start. And I think visibility is just going to be what drives us forward, because I think there is a demand there for it. So yeah, I would highly recommend anyone listening, go watch a game.
Yeah, as you said, it's okay to, right?
Yeah, it's okay to. You have my permission. You can go and watch a wheelchair basketball game.
And again, as I mentioned, you know, previously in one of my answers, as I was watching, it's like, wait, I know what this is. I know what they're running. I know what they're doing. Like I like you said, it's just a different form of basketball. I guess it's still basketball. Like a lot of the things that we would normally associate with basketball are taking place and are happening. And it's like, oh, I know what this is. I know what this looks like. I know what this
is.
And
if you already know basketball, within like the first half, you'll get to grips with the differences and the way that, you know, oh, that screen, the pick and roll is slightly different, but it's effectively still a pick and roll. Like you'll recognize it all. So if you already know basketball, it'll be easy to switch to wheelchair basketball.
Awesome. Wonderful. To wrap up, there's a couple of questions that I ask every guest. So I will start with this first one here. Thinking back on your playing career, professional career, however you want to interpret that, what is a moment from your career that you think others listening would be able to learn from?
Yeah, this was a really difficult question. So, you know, I retired from the Great Britain team last month, so it's quite recent. So I've been doing a lot of reflecting on the time that I played internationally. I think for me, one of my biggest regrets in that time was how long it took me to find my own playing style and what worked best for me, for me to be the most effective player on court that I could be. For a large part of my career, I was coached by a very confident and opinionated coach, shall we say. He had a very clear idea in his head of how he wanted me to play. And being quite new to the international scene, I deferred to him as the expert. You know, you do what your coach says, right?
Yeah, of course.
So I spent hours and hours trying to be the player that he wanted me to be, the way that he wanted me to shoot, the way he wanted me to handle the ball, the way he wanted me to be on court. And I was, you know, in the gym in the evenings on my own, just working and working and working. But I was never going to excel that way. That's not where my strengths lied at all. I think, you know, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. He had a vision in his head of what the team was going to look like if I played that way, but
Sure.
I suspect he just couldn't envision me playing in a different way to the way that he had in his head. And I think that stunted my growth as an athlete. Because as soon as he stopped being my coach and I was almost sort of, you know, given permission to explore the best way for me to play, I excelled. And unfortunately, I think that was just a little bit too late in my career for me to really make an impact on the international scene. But, you know, I take full responsibility for myself and how I developed as a player. But I honestly think that coach prevented me from being the best version of me that I could be as an athlete. So I suppose in a very long-winded way, what I'm trying to say is, you know, diversity makes a team stronger. Yeah. Like obviously you want the team to be able to gel and work together on court, but you don't necessarily want 12 carbon copies of the same player. Like you need players that are able to do different things. That's why you've got 12 on the bench. So I suppose my advice to coaches, like new coaches maybe, would be, don't be so prescriptive with how you want a player to be, but just help guide them into becoming the best player that they can, working in the style that's best for them.
Yeah, and it's such a common thing. It's such a common thread I hear from coaches. They talk about it all the time, and we, I think as coaches, we try to, some of us maybe better than others, to, you know, talk about like coaching the players you have versus like getting them to fit some model that you have in your head of what you want your players to be. Like, no, you coach who you have, and it's a challenge, I think, and again, some coaches adapt better than others, probably because some have like in their mind, like, this is what I want my final product to be, and we're going to make sure we get there no matter what, versus like, why am I trying to do all of this work to get a player to be a certain way when I can just play to what they do and just work with that. It's probably a lot easier to do that model, but I know every coach, as you mentioned, they have their own philosophy on those.
Yes.
Yeah. So to wrap up, I give every guest what I call a 60-second soapbox, though I've never timed anyone, so I'm not going to start today either. So this is for you to kind of get out a kind of like a final idea, a closing message, some sort of final thought that you want to leave the listeners with, and you are more than welcome to interpret that however you want. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up the floor to you, and I'm just going to kind of let you take it from here.
Oh, thank you. I suppose really to just sort of reinforce what I've already said, you know, athletes with a disability are just as competitive as athletes without. We're not in it for the participation medal. We are there to win. Wheelchair basketball is as fast and exciting to watch as able-bodied basketball. And if, you know, you've got 40 minutes to spare, I would highly recommend anyone go and watch a game. There's plenty of them on YouTube, especially from the last Paralympics. If you have a wheelchair basketball club in your area, check it out. They've probably got a live stream or a local game. And if you're sharing things on social media about basketball, consider sharing something about wheelchair basketball. Just, you know, one person might see that and another person might see that and another person, and they might pass it on to people they might know. And really, visibility is going to help so many people just get into basketball, because basketball is what we love, right?
Yeah. No, it's a great message. Promote it, you know, get it out there and check it out, promote it. And Yeah, I mean, I did some research and I just looked in my area and I was like, there's a lot. There's a lot even just around where I live in terms of a wheelchair basketball, but it is something I didn't know, and partly because, as you mentioned, right, it's just like not promoted a lot. So if you don't know
Mhm.
that it exists, like it's not like it's being promoted to me either, like, but now that I have a little bit more awareness and I can use this platform to get more exposure out it. And I think, as you kind of mentioned, if everybody kind of does that a little bit, checks it out and promotes it, like there'll be potentially like a fair bit of growth and a fair bit more of interest. So it's the least
Mhm.
we can kind of do is
Yeah,
just
yeah,
promote it. We all got social media and everything, right?
yeah, for sure.
Awesome. I want to thank you again for spending some time talking basketball, talking wheelchair basketball, and just kind of talking about the sport in general. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, and even if some of the things I learned should have been obvious to me, I learned them or had them reinforced to me for what you talked about. So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck going forward. And hopefully sometime in the near future, those who are playing professionally and get paid for it too, because they deserve it. So thank you so much.
For sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for considering wheelchair basketball in your podcast. I think it's great that you're looking to diversify that. So thank you.
And thank you. And thank you all for listening. This was another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. We will see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Make sure to connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, or reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time.